In a world where everything is seemingly the same and nothing truly stands out, everything is made by the push of a button on a computer that controls a giant robot the size of a massive warehouse. Furniture begins to lose its meaning, loses its connection to us, becomes an object that we use every day but aren't truly connected with. And let's be real, the design becomes pretty drab. In this video, I'll be making a piece of furniture that is not only beautiful, but will stand the test of time and be completely functional. So please stay with me while I take a pile of wood and metal and turn it into this.
Bro, look at that! That's massive. That's gonna hang on the wall.
This video is not only about the furniture and what has been created, but the process of making it and the enjoyment that comes with it. And that will be forever embedded into the furniture.
Jesus Christ.
Now that I've very efficiently removed all the bark, I'm going to split the slab down the center. One half is going to be the top of the desk, and then the other half is going to be for the drawers, specifically the drawer faces, and that's because there's this really cool bark inclusion part that I want to include in a really unique way. One of the most important things I try to incorporate into my furniture is the material you use should have a profound impact on the design. Now, if you haven't already noticed, this is in my old shop, and this video was actually filmed a very long time ago, hence me struggling with the track saw. This, I believe, was the first or second time I had used a track saw, and I didn't really understand exactly how to use it, but I slowly figured it out. And that means this drum sander was quite new to me too. I believe this is one of the first 5 times I had to use this drum sander, and I was trying to use it with 40 grit to help start to flatten out the slab. I know the drum sander won't make it perfectly flat, but if I at least get the high spots down, then it'll save me a lot of time with the hand plane.
It's because you have the strap so far forward. You look like you're like Amish.
Honestly, I kind of regret trying to use the drum sander to do this. I honestly think it would have been faster just to do it with a hand plane, but you live and you learn. I spent about an hour, maybe 2, just trying to get it roughly flat, like just the high spots get lower. That's all I was really doing. And then the next morning I came to my senses and I took my joiner plane and just started hogging off a bunch of material, and this worked way better than the drum sander. As you can see here, there's this nice wave cup potato chip shape in this board. So I have to remove a ton of material from the ends and the sides, and then it'll be mostly flat. So I'm just going to go through and remove a bunch of material, check it with the level. This at the time was the longest level I had, which probably wasn't the most accurate, but I made it work. So if you're a modern day woodworker and you have never hand flattened a slab, I highly recommend it. It teaches you a lot about hand planes, handwork, and it just really shows you that it's not that hard. It's just a little time consuming, but it lets you see the slab from a completely different perspective, and it's really enjoyable and well worth it. This is probably the 10th big slab I've hand flattened, and I'm definitely going to do it again, even though I have access to a ginormous wide belt sander and a ginormous planer and a ginormous jointer. Once I had gotten the first side flat, I struck a line using a marking gauge to show where I need to plane down to on the opposite side to make it parallel to the original side I flattened. That's a lot of material, which is why I'm using this tool. This is a powered hand plane. Yeah, kind of weird tool, kind of niche, don't see a lot of people using it, but it just kind of helps speed up the process of removing the majority of the material. It doesn't leave that flat or consistent of a surface, so I am going to go back and re-plane it with a hand plane. And now that the top is mostly flat, let's focus on building the carcass for the drawers. Now to do that, I need to take this section of wood and this section of wood and make them a lot wider and thinner. And just because only kindergarten teachers can read this blueprint on how I'm going to do that, doesn't mean it's not a good plan. After breaking down the left half of that slab into smaller chunks, I headed over to the jointer. Because my 6-inch jointer wasn't quite wide enough to flatten this 8-inch board, I took the guard off and flattened as much as I could, and that left this little strip here that it missed. but that's okay because what I'm going to do is isolate the flat section. And to do that, I take a known flat board and double side tape it only to the flat part. This allows me to take that part that I missed on the jointer earlier and hang it over, hence isolating the flat part that I created on the jointer, and then making a parallel edge off of that little section of flat. I ended up finding this really cool bullet in the slab, and now that the slabs are flat, I'm going to label them, that way I can resaw them and book match them. Now onto the resawing. I use the micro jig center finder to set up everything, and then I just double check to make sure that the blade is exactly in my pre-saw before I do the final cut. And as you can see here, there was a little adjustment that needed to be made. Nowadays, I don't pre-saw for my resaw anymore, and the pre-saw are those grooves that I cut at the table saw before I run it through the bandsaw, and that just removes a lot of material. But originally, I had my bandsaw set up on the high speed with the low torque, so you can hear it. I mean, it just kind of struggles cutting through. But once I switched the belt onto lower speed but higher torque, it cuts way better. I'm going to add some biscuits into the two panels that I just resawed. That way when I glue them up, there's the beautiful book match effect and they'll line up nice and easily. I happen to be out of biscuits, so I'm just cutting a wide slot, which is why I'm taking multiple small passes and just kind of wiggling it along. And then I just cut some rectangular pieces of wood and slid them in there, and they work the same as biscuits. I went ahead and added a splash of glue inside the holes for the biscuits and onto the actual edge joint itself. Now you can go ahead and see those handmade biscuits yourself. Once I got everything slid together as tightly as I could by hand, I went ahead and threw on a couple clamps on the top and the same amount of clamps on the bottom. This is going to help prevent warping, and I went ahead and checked it with a straight edge as I'm going, and if it's starting to lean one way, I just tighten it a little bit. Once everything was glued up though, it was a little bit too wide to fit through my planer, so I just took my jointer plane and smoothed it out the best that I could, and it turned out really well. Now that I got those two panels flattened up, I'm going to take them over and straighten out the ends. This little crosscut sliding thing that I built was kind of jank, but it actually got the job done, and I'm just using the fence here to make sure that both the panels are the exact same width. Now I forgot to film it, but I went ahead and made a back panel for the carcass out of plywood. And now we need to take the two side panels and cut a groove in them, that way the back panel can slide into them. I didn't feel like setting up my dado stack, so I just did a couple passes and tapped the fence over until I got a nice snug fit that wasn't too tight that it'll squeeze out all the glue, but would still fit in there nice and firm. Now this fit definitely took a couple tries, but once I got it to slide in, it was way easier to set up the next one. Now before I glued the entire carcass together, I wanted to make sure I got this bark inclusion out, so I took a chisel and just hogged out all the bark and then filled it with epoxy. Now this carcass is going to have 3 drawers, and in between the drawers I cut a dado, that way I could slide a 1/4 inch piece of plywood. This will give the carcass a lot more rigidity, as well as in between the drawer fronts, because I'm doing this really cool live edge crack thing that you'll see later. I need there to be a piece of wood, that way you can't just see into the hollow out carcass. So I added this little mortise there, and these pieces will be glued on over that 1/4 inch piece and slightly mortised into the side panels, and it turns out really well. Unfortunately, right as I was going to add in the 1/4 inch piece of plywood, my camera died. But you can see right here the little face plates that will go in between the drawer fronts and help add a nice piece of wood into the negative space. The carcass is done for right now, so what I need to figure out is exactly how wide to make the drawers. So I measured the exact thickness of the hardware, and then I cut out 2 spacer blocks, slid them on either side, and then cut out a sample piece of wood and tested exactly the right fit. So it was snug, but not tight, to make sure that it wouldn't bind up. Because once I cut the size of the final drawer, there won't be much wiggle room. I can't remove that much material. So this is a very critical measurement, so I don't trust my tape measure to do it. Because a reference-based measurement, which is what the story stick is way more precise. I also cut a story stick that will be the exact depth of the drawer that I can use. Using those story sticks, I set up a stopper block on my chop saw, cut out all the pieces, and then use this little jig here to cut out all the miters. This ensures that everything is the exact depth and width that it needs to be to fit perfectly, maximizing the amount of space in the carcass. I also made sure to label everything, that way I could keep the grain continuity consistent. That way it looks like just one straight board that got folded up into a box. I went ahead and dabbed on some glue onto all of the miters and threw on these really nice frame clamps. After all 3 of the boxes were dry, I went ahead and took my hand plane and just made sure that all of the tops lined up and were perfectly flat and that there was no wobble. Nowadays, I use my drum sander to do this, and it seems to work a little bit more consistent, just as consistently as this handle falls off my planer. Now, after replacing the stripped bolt on my handle, I finished truing up the tops and bottoms of all those boxes. Now, to install the drawer slides, I went ahead to use my Fireball Tools magnetic shims, and these were a great way to do it. It worked really well, and it all slid together super precisely and quick. Now, the last step for the carcass was to add these little brackets. That way I can hang it onto the bottom of the floating desk. And I went ahead and clamped on a little sacrificial piece of wood. That way I could drill over the edge, and then I don't have to do any extra chiseling. It'll just slide right on. And because these brackets only have one screw holding them, it will allow for wood movement, and I'm going to make sure not to tighten it down too much. That way when the wood expands and contracts, this whole drawer can kind of wiggle back and forth just so slightly. After sliding all the drawers in, I turned my attention to the drawer faces. I have these really fun, weird offcuts, and I want to figure out how to make them into the drawer faces and not have to add any hardware. I want to use the live edge sticking out right there so you can stick your fingers in it and pull the drawers in and out. But the live edge is going to need a little tune-up. So I'm sketching out exactly where I want to put the live edge, and it still be congruent and you can still slide your fingers in there comfortably, and I want it to look nice, but I gotta make sure I don't make the gap too big. The other challenge these unique pieces of wood for the drawer faces pose is that there's no straight edge. Literally nothing for me to reference. So I just kind of have to jiggle it into place to where I think it's gonna work, and then I mark the back side of them, and I use my bandsaw just to cut all of the edges, and then hopefully they're really parallel and line up good, and hopefully everything works in the end.
So I have that board that is on the that's tenuted in there that holds the cabinet together, and that is only 1.5 inches. So I need to make this gap show only that board and not the drawer front itself, or else it'll look weird when it's sliding in and out. So I'm trying to make it so we can cut this live edge section and still have that book match and not go too far to where you'll see the actual drawer itself. So just kind of sketching that out, but I'm kind of blind eyeballing it because I can't see jack diddly. So I'm hoping this is somewhat, and if it's not, then I'll cry a little bit.
Now I'm going to use the bandsaw to carve the live edge. Trigger warning, this is a controversial subject, but I really wanted these two pieces to be book matched. So it's not possible for me to have a live edge in the center. So no matter what, I'm going to have to kind of add a faux live edge, but whatever, leave your hate comments down below. I think it looks beautiful in the end. Now I'm just using the bandsaw to remove the bulk of the material. I will remove the rest of it with a spoke shave and a draw knife. So I tilted the bed of the bandsaw at a 30-degree angle, and then I cut the back side and then the front side, and this leaves kind of a dome triangle-ish shape, which makes it a lot easier and a lot faster to remove the rest of the material to get that perfect final shape with the spoke shave. One of the other problems with using these unique cuts of wood for the actual drawer fronts is this magnificent bark inclusion. Yeah, it's massive. And it's going to be really pretty because I'm going to fill it with epoxy after I clean out every little speck of bark. And it's just one of my favorite features when it's done. It just looks so good. After I got the bulk of it out, I took a wire brush and a little dental tool and scraped off as much of that bark as I could. You really want as much raw wood exposed as possible, that way the epoxy has something to soak into and bond permanently with. Now I tape off all of the holes and the edges. That way when I pour the epoxy, fingers crossed, it doesn't leak everywhere. And I actually got pretty lucky. I don't remember it leaking that much. And I don't even know how that's possible. There's like 4 pieces of tape holding all this epoxy in. I would never do this now, but while I had the epoxy out, I went ahead and filled a couple little holes on the other drawer faces. That way the color matches perfectly because it's all from the same batch. After letting the epoxy cure for 2 days, I went ahead and flattened it and then used my spoke shave to remove all of the extra bark on the live edge and then very gingerly rounded over that edge so it was nice and comfortable to grab and slide that drawer out. I cut a rabbet on the bottom side of each drawer, that way I could put a piece of plywood for the bottom of the drawer. But that left a rounded corner because router bits are circular. So I used that little spring-loaded corner cutting thing and I just squared off all the corners. Then I went ahead and started sanding everything, which took a while. After installing all the boxes, I turned my attention back to the top. So this is going to be butting against an extra wall, and we don't want it to stick out, but we want to have the depth of the big desk. So I kind of curved the live edge, that way it meshed into the wall, but you still get that extra depth in the center of the desk. There was also a secret advantage on the side that wasn't going to be butted against a wall, that it won't stick out, so you won't hit your hip on it. You're just kind of a lot less likely to run into the edge of the desk that's sticking out with this nice curved taper. But because I cut it, I need to blend in that live edge. So I'm doing this kind of controversial texturing technique. Yeah, kind of a weird one. I don't really do this a lot now, but it actually looked really great, and it was hard to even tell that this wasn't the way the live edge originally went. Now there's 1,000 different ways to break the edge of a piece of wood. That way it's smooth and it won't chip out, but this is one of my favorite ways to do this. Take this little tiny hand plane, and it's just so enjoyable to make a nice curved or chamfered edge. Next up is the very tedious task of filling all of these holes. So every time you see one of those gray patches, that's from an ambrosia beetle digging into the wood and leaving a fungus behind that leaves this gray stretch. But they also leave behind these holes, which need to be filled so it's nice and smooth. And I kind of go back and forth from filling the holes, and then I'll sand a grit, and then I'll refill any little holes that I find, and then I'll sand, and yeah, it's kind of a long, mind-boggling process. This whole step takes almost an entire day. Once the top is complete, I do the exact same thing to the sides and the live edge, going through from 80 grit all the way up to 220 grit. The top is now done, yay! But we need a way to hang it onto the wall. This entire floating desk and the cabinet will be hanging off the wall, not supported by the ground in any way. So I need a really beefy bracket to hold this entire thing up, because I want to be able to stand on the edge of this desk with no deflection. So that required me to fabricate this really beefy frame that'll slide inside of the top of the floating shelf. Because the right side of this desk will be butted against a wall, that gives me the advantage of making an L-shaped frame. But for the desk to be able to slide over the L-shaped frame, I need to cut a ginormous mortise. So I fabricated this little 90-degree platform. That way, when I use my track saw to hog off the majority of material, there's a nice big spot for the track saw to be supported on. And I just double-sided taped it down and clamped my track saw on and lined it up very carefully to those lines and made my cuts. well, I've tried to make cuts. Dead battery is an easy fix, though. Now this was probably the hardest part of the entire project, was lining up this frame in my shop. That way when I go to install it, I can cut away the drywall, hang this frame directly on the studs, and then just easily slide the desk onto this frame. Now, this was a very daunting task because these holes were massive, because I need the rods from this frame to go very deep into the wood, that way it'll support it nicely. But long story short, I lost all that footage, so I can't actually show you the install. But I can show you me staining it. And it turned out really well. The color of this wood was really pretty. I did 2 coats of Rubio Monocoat and then 4 coats of the N3 Nano from Blacktail Studios. And that gives you a super durable, super pretty finish that will last a very long time and is repairable, which is great. So if at any point this gets damaged, the client can call me up and I can very easily spot repair it. Now, of all the recent breakthroughs in woodworking in the last couple of years, this N3 Nano is one of my favorite. It applies a ceramic coat, a nano thick ceramic coat, the same stuff they use on really high-end cars to make it bead water for years. This works great, and I don't know much about it. I've used it a ton. I've never had any issues with it. Super easy to install, but if you want more info about it, check out Blacktail Studios.
Alright, we got all the drywall cut out, we slid this bracket in, got it all screwed in there, we drilled and countersunk all of our holes, and now I'm ready to slide the top on. Ew. Alright, so what we're doing right now might look a little funny, but it's very practical. I'm using walrus oil, they're hard wax, and what this does is for the next 10 minutes it's going to be really nice and slippery, act like some sort of lubricant when we slide the table on. And then once it dries, it's going to harden and end up with an almost film-like finish that's going to lock it in. That on top of it's going to help protect our vacuum seal so that this table basically can't come off once it slides on. We're going to wipe this on all of the pegs.